Well, good morning. I hope everyone is bright-eyed and bushy-tailed and well-rested and all that good stuff. So I don't think I ever told you I came up with a title for the spiritual exercises, but being me, I'm not big into titles, so even though if I invent them, then I forget about them and forget to use them and tell you, but now I'm going to tell you. So somebody asked me when I was promoting spiritual exercise, hey, is there a theme or something to it? And I said yes. The theme is Daughters of Eve. So there you go, Daughters of Eve. Now, some of you are giving me those faces like, okay, well, Eve is the fallen one. Well, that's us, but there's also a new Eve out there. So we're also daughters of the new Eve. So you can be positive and just wait. It's coming. And the reason I bring that up is because I think at this moment of the spiritual exercises, we tend to go back to the beginnings. So this morning we're going to meditate precisely on Eve. And in the Garden of Eden, interestingly enough, I could tell, this is just personal anecdote. For whatever reason, the weeks leading up to the spiritual exercises were just tremendously annoying because it's kind of like every time you want to sit down and do something, you got some fire to put out, or somebody wants something, or something unexpected happens, or something breaks, or whatever. So I think I was in the middle of that when I was printing up your readings. I got the first half of the readings down, and then actually the part that was most important I forgot to put on your sheets. So if you have your Bibles, you can supplement later on, okay? So last night we referred to the fact that God is calling us out into the desert. And he does that. A desert is a place of purification. It's a place of silence so that it can become a place of prayer and a place of encounter with himself. And that's the purpose of deserts, not just so he can leave you there dry and barren, but so that, as in the reading from Hosea in particular said, that it's a place of betrothal. God wants to invite your soul again to renew that betrothal, and the place that takes place is going to be a desert. The original place of God's betrothal with humanity was a garden. And again, using the broad sense of the word desert, not necessarily sandy, but in terms of kind of a deserted place, a place where man was alone in the world. That was the Garden of Eden. And that's what we're going to do. Our first meditation on is going to be what was God's original plan when he created us, and with a particular emphasis on the creation of Eve. So we have our readings here, and every year you do exercises, you're going to get the same readings, because when you go to the Garden of Eden, there's not a lot to pick from. It's like you're stuck with Genesis 1 and 2. Deal with it. In Genesis chapter 1, we know that in Genesis there are two creation accounts, right? There's Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Interestingly enough, Genesis 1 seems to have been written after Genesis 2. Genesis 2 seems to be the older one. Genesis 1 is, quote-unquote, a little more scientific. It goes through the different 7 stages, whatnot. Genesis 2 is kind of more interpersonal, dealing with the fact that God... It doesn't deal so much with how did God create the world. It deals a lot more with just how did God create us and what makes us different. So in Genesis 1, God says, let us make human beings in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, the tame animals, and all the wild animals, and all the creatures that crawl on the earth. God created mankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. I kind of cut to the chase in the book of Genesis because otherwise you'll read 2 entire chapters to get through the creation account, and we're just going to deal with that which I think is essential. Out of all the things that God created, there's only one thing where God says he created them, us, in his image and likeness. He also, there's only one thing where he says it's not only good, but it's very good. What makes us very good? Well, because we're in his image and likeness. So from the very beginning of our creation, God made us different. And I think we're in a beautiful setting, and the weather permitting, I would recommend, especially maybe these morning meditations, just to kind of go out and enjoy the surroundings a little bit. And contemplate. You'll see trees and squirrels and deer and all that stuff. And none of that is made in God's image and likeness. It's made out of love by God, but nothing that is surrounding us is made for its own sake. Everything that we see outside there, God made, and it glorifies him, but he made it for us. It is part of his gift to us. And when God made all the rest of the things that we'll see outside our windows and when we walk around out there, he made it maybe chronologically before us, at least in certain cases. But he always made it with a mind to the fact that we would be coming and that this is part of his gift to us. There's a current that keeps on popping up throughout history, which is we're just another piece of creation, and therefore, we should be a little bit humble about things and know our place and, not upset the apple cart too much, right? And that's completely false. We are not just another piece of creation. We are the reason why physical creation even exists. The Hubble telescope, and I forget what's the new one? The one that's even more powerful, that sees all kinds of crazy stuff, like the beginnings of the universe. They actually recently think they caught echoes of waves, not even light waves, I don't know what kind of waves, from like the Big Bang and the beginnings of the universe, and all that stuff that God created billions of years ago. So I can put on my Carl Sagan voice and go, billions and billions of... all of that was created with a mind to us. When I was in college and I would study chemistry, and I was a hopeless chemist and engineer. I only had a couple semesters, and then I discovered Jesus and the Legion of Christ, and I said, okay, enough. But I remember because I was learning how to pray during those years, and I would contemplate, I would kind of just do this exercise. When you study chemistry, you study the micro a lot, the molecular and the atomic and the subatomic and whatnot. And thinking to myself, on a level that we haven't even reached yet, and we will never be able to reach. I mean, there are particles that are too small. We know they exist, but they're too small to observe, because you would have to bombard them with something like an electron that is size considerably larger than the particle itself. And, it's... I mean, in trying to physically observe it, you basically break it. So... but there are particles out there that are so minute that speculatively we know that they have to exist, and there are some tests, I don't know what kind and how they come up with these conclusions that say all these subatomic particles exist, but we'll never even be able to see them. And God created those. He created us from them, and he created those for us, and so to speak. And that God that has such a minute eye to detail that he creates things infinitesimal that we will never even be able to speculate. Things, I'm sure there are plenty of things to roughly quote Shakespeare. I forget the quote, but he says, there are more things in creation than your philosophy will ever reach. I forget what it was. It was in Hamlet. All of that God created thinking of us. And then going to the other end of the spectrum, when you do the Carl Sagan thing and you start looking at galaxies that are so far away that we'll never even know they exist, and the images that we catch, which are trillions of years away. I guess the Voyager 1 and Voyager 2, Voyager 1 is now starting to have problems. The poor old guy is coming up on 50 years old, and it's starting to send back garbled messages that don't make any sense. Just it speaks in binary and thinks in binary, which is, just a bunch of ones and zeros. But now it's just going 1 0 1 0 1 0 1 0, not actually saying anything. It's just like white noise. And Voyager 1 has apparently reached what is currently considered to be kind of the edge of our solar system after 50 years. 50 years of going very fast. And, it's just a little blip in the galaxy that Voyager 1 has reached. And this is the galaxy, this is the creation God has made with us in mind. But only when he created Adam and Eve did he say, let us make human beings in our image after our likeness. Let them have dominion over everything we just talked about. The fish of the sea and the birds of the air. We were created in his image. In the image of God he created them, male and female he created them. What does it mean to be created in the image and likeness of God? Has anyone ever thunk of that one? In theology, the church fathers always have something to say about everything. So in theology, they make a distinction between the image and likeness. They're not actually the same thing. And this actually does appear in the Catechism, because I used to get excited about those things when I studied theology. Now that I'm old, I don't care anymore. But when you're young and you're cracking open books and you're like, oh, this is so fascinating. The image of God means he made us spiritual beings. And being a spiritual being means that when he created Adam and Eve, he endowed you with an intellect and a will, which is different than any other creature out there. You may think that Fluffy the poodle has an intellect. It doesn't. It doesn't have a spiritual intellect. It has, obviously a set of instincts, and it can do certain things. It can, quote unquote, figure things out. But Fluffy the poodle is not capable of speculative thought. It can realize something looks dangerous and make a sensory judgment. It can memorize certain things. Oh, it's feeding time, so I need to be here. And it can know that the owners love it and whatnot. But it can't speculate and say, well, today it's kind of cloudy. I wonder what tomorrow's going to be like. Looking at the weather front out there, that requires an abstract thought process. Which is something that only a spiritual being can do. Only a spiritual being can truly enter into a relationship of love. A relationship where you are willing to consciously sacrifice yourself for the one that you love. Consciously make yourself a gift. And where you can contemplate, as lovers do, even when the person that you love is gone, you can contemplate those things that you love about the person that you love. When you first fall in love with a person, you probably spend a sizable percentage of your time, either consciously or kind of in the back of your mind, just thinking about the person you love and the beauty therein and all the things that you love about that person. Like I said, Fluffy the poodle will never do that. As much as your dog may be loyal and find their fulfillment and everything in you, it's on a natural level. To be created in the image, in the likeness of God, rather, means that they were filled with sanctifying grace. So what is it that makes us like God? And his image means we're capable of him because we have an intellect and a will, so we can choose to enter into a relationship with him, and we can choose to accept his gifts of love, and we can choose to interact. To be in his likeness means that we possess his life, sanctifying grace in our souls, and it transforms us and makes us God-like. And all of us have experienced in our day-to-day lives, because we're fallen, unlike Adam and Eve in the moment of creation, we've all experienced the difference between when we're kind of full of God's grace and when we're not so full of God's grace. And maybe sometimes, tragically, there have been moments when we don't have any of God's grace in us, at least sanctifying grace. And we need to get to confession and get back into those good graces. And all of us have experienced moments where prayer comes easily, where the things of God come naturally, where it feels like God is right there, and other moments where even the simplest thing seems to annoy us, and we're being mean and short-tempered with people and whatnot. And so we look back at ourselves and I say, what is wrong with me? Okay. That's the difference between God being in the soul or God not being in the soul. Or it's the difference between truly living in his likeness, so to speak, or not. Then the Lord God formed man. Okay, now we're to Genesis chapter 2. The creation just of Adam. And it's interesting, Genesis 2 distinguishes between the creation of Adam and Eve. And I think this is part of what makes Genesis 2 so beautiful. Because we see the similarity and the difference, the unity and the diversity, if you wish, between Adam and Eve. The Lord God formed the man out of the dust of the ground and blew into his nostrils the breath of life. So, and that is what the name Adam means. Adama, I'm not sure how it is pronounced in ancient Hebrew, just means earth, clay, soil, dust. So when God takes the earth, Adama, and blows his breath, which is ruah, which is spirit. The word breath in Hebrew is the same word for spirit, which is why we have wonderfully confusing Bible passages like when Jesus talks to Nicodemus and says, the Spirit blows where it wills and you do not know where it comes and where it goes and whatnot. And he's talking about, because the same word for spirit and wind applies, and he's saying both things at once. It's not, you're trying to, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Well, he's saying simultaneously the wind blows and the Spirit blows and you don't know where it's coming from or where it's going to go. And so it is with the children of God. So here God takes material, the mud, the clay of the earth, and he blows his life into it. And so man became a living being, living in a different way than, you know, the neighborhood skunk, which I saw one not too long ago. I think when I was pulling into the driveway, I saw a skunk yesterday. So they exist here. I didn't get too close and observe. So we are living in a different way, though, than everything else in the world is living. We have God's life in us. Then later on it says, the Lord God planted a garden in Eden and placed there the man whom he had formed. And it talks about the creation of all the trees and everything that was delightful. And in the middle of the garden was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Again, there's church fathers and thinkers have come up with, okay, what is the garden that he's talking about? Was it a physical place or is it an interior garden like the garden of a soul? And the answer, as is usually the case, is yes, it's both. So he clearly was in a physical place, but more importantly, it is the fact that when you're living in God's grace, and when, especially like Adam and Eve, when you are immaculate, perfect human beings, creation is, so to speak, a garden for you. And your soul, there's a garden, the difference between a garden and just wilderness is there's a certain harmony, right? Gardens tend to be tended. So in this interior garden, as the church fathers will say, the different trees will represent different virtues and different aspects of the spiritual life, and everything is harmonious. And in the middle are these two uber important trees, the tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that is God's domain. When I was reading over this, it occurred to me the other day, it reminds me very much of St. Teresa of Avila and the interior castle. I don't know, that's a spiritual classic, very deep. And it is, Teresa of Avila likens the human soul to a castle. Remember, she was in the 1500s, so this is back when you still had kings and princes and whatnot. And so castles were still a big deal. And she says, in this interior castle, Christ resides. But he resides in the very central inner chamber. And the only people that get to go in there are his intimate friends. So it's a spiritual book about talking about this interior journey of your own soul and learning how to discover Christ in the interior depths of your soul so as to live in this total, passionate, loving relationship with him. And I think this garden passage is very similar. In the center of the garden, what do we find? We find the tree of life, which we could refer to as the tree of sanctifying grace, the life of God, and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We'll look at the tree of knowledge of good and evil later on, but it's not just knowing what is right and wrong. Adam and Eve already knew what was right and wrong. In fact, they had a much clearer idea of it, I think, than we do, because they had perfect human intellects and they were totally aligned with God and God's will. When you read the Bible, a lot of the times they talk of the word to know is a very broad word. So it's like Adam knew Eve, and then Cain and Abel came forth. Well, it's a different kind of knowledge, and knowing that 2 and 2 are 4, right? It's in Spanish and some of the Romance languages, you have the difference between saber and conocer. So saber is intellectual knowledge. Like I know, saber, that 2 and 2 are 4. Conocer is I know you as a person. It's an experiential knowledge. In English, for whatever reason, we don't seem to make that distinction in our language. It's just out of context that we pick up what version of it that we're referring to. So it's something similar here. The knowledge of good and evil, this experiential knowledge, in the case of Adam and Eve, it's not the fact that they know what is right and wrong. It's ultimately the power to decide for yourself. Who decides what is good and evil? And what the Garden of Eden in the book of Genesis is telling us is that is God's domain. And that's in the center of the garden, that's sacred ground. And finally, the part that I didn't print for you, so you get to use your own Bibles and dig it up, comes the part that was most important in this meditation. Adam is in the garden. God has given him the job to till the garden, which is an important word. The word to till obviously means that he's given Adam a part in taking care of creation, working creation, in a certain sense co-creating with God. But the word to till is, interestingly enough, the same word that they used, that the Jewish people used for the priestly service. The priests tilled, so to speak, the temple, or I don't know what they tilled, but it was a function of priesthood. See, Hebrew is an interesting language. It's a very primitive language with very broad, narrow vocabulary. So one word would frequently mean like 5, 6, 7 different things that don't seem to us to be particularly related, like till, priesthood, priestly function. How does that all work? And why would God choose Hebrew then? Because if some schmuck like me is speaking in a primitive language, then you're very limited. But if a genius, such as God, takes a language like that, with one word, he's able to say 4 or 5 things and mean them all at the same time. And God does that regularly. Again, go back to Nicodemus and Jesus. The wind blows where it will, and he's saying 2 distinct things separately at the same time, and they're both equally true. And it's pretty cool. And Jesus did that with some frequency in the Gospels. Then God says, it is not good for man to be alone. And he creates Eve. And I will do something radical and pull up my own Bible so I can actually know what I'm talking about. So God said it's not good for man to be alone. I'm going to skip over the creation of all the animals because none of them seemed to do it for Adam. But what God is saying is that Adam by himself was incomplete. And this is kind of the shtick. Adam in and of himself was an incomplete being. Adam, even though Adam is in relationship with God and with nature, there's still something missing to him. And humanity, if humanity were simply Adam, would be incomplete. And there's a distinction, therefore, between us, for example, and the angels. Each angel is, I don't know this, you knew this, but each angel is its own species, and there are considered to be more angels out there than there are human beings ever created. So God, again, going to my Carl Sagan verse, billions and billions of angels, who knows how many billions of angels God created, and each one is a unique species. Isn't that cool? Which means that even though they form choirs and they are pure spirits, and so in a broad sense, as pure spirits, they are, you could call them kind of a species. But each one, therefore, primarily is in a direct relationship with God, and they are complete in and of themselves. God is what completes them, so to speak, that relationship with God. But the relationship with anything else in the cosmos is kind of accidental or secondary in the case of an angel. With humanity, that's not true. Adam, by himself, in the cosmos, even talking and walking with God, there was still something missing. Something that was lacking in his being in the image and likeness of God. So eventually God creates what he refers to as a helpmate, a helper, which doesn't mean a servant or a sidekick or anything like that. And he creates Eve. And this idea of helping, to me, this is important and is beautiful. The word helper, for those who are language scholars, again, I am not one of them. I just take what other smart people say and repeat it. So the word helper here means that Eve was created, she was co-missioned with Adam. So Adam was given a mission: cultivate, take care of the earth, in a certain sense improve it, because we get to do that. We can go into areas where things are just wild and chaotic and swamp and whatever, and by our labors we can increase the beauty. We don't always do it, but we can. We can increase the beauty and the harmony, and we can perfect, the earth around us. And God, who is not jealous, God is glorified when we live up to our mission of beautifying and improving and perfecting things around us, because it's the same way that a parent is glorified when your kids start going out and actually doing things and, accomplishing things. Good parents at least, don't get jealous or angry or say, hey, wait a minute, I taught you how to do it. No, good parents love when their kids start excelling and hopefully even doing things better than their parents do. We will never be better than God, but God is glorified and delighted when he sees us doing what we were made to do and doing it well. But so Eve was created by God to be a helpmate, which means that she would assist Adam in the same mission, but she would contribute something different. She would complement him. They would work together as a team, and each one of them would be complementary or intercomplementary in working together in this task. And this is the point where, this is strictly Father Eric speaking now. If you look at Genesis, it's clear that Adam's first job was to work in the world, so to speak, is till the garden, which, as we said, means ultimately to be like the priest of the cosmos. In Adam's work, at least partially in Adam's work, humanity is meant to be like the priest, so to speak, of the cosmos. We speak on behalf of all of material reality. We're the only part of material reality that has a relationship with God, and we, in a certain sense, offer up everything that is in material reality to God, and through us, God sanctifies creation, and we act in a priestly capacity on behalf of this physical cosmos. And Adam, part of it is by the way that he worked and operated in the world, he gave meaning to this random material world. And his focus primarily is always going to be that. And if you look at humanity today, look at the difference between husbands and wives a lot of the time. Men, generally speaking, are still out in the workplace, and we tend to, because now we're fallen men, but we tend to find our identity and our meaning in what do we do. And if you want to show off, you show off by saying what position you have, right? What do you do? How much money have you made? What do you look up to, okay, wow, this guy. Like right now, I'm listening to the biography of Steve Jobs. I just listened to Elon Musk, another eccentric genius, crazy guy, same author. So I listened to one and I said, well, I may as well do the other half, which is these two giants. And for all that, each one of them has all kinds of personality quirks and personal problems and issues and everything. Nonetheless, people admire them greatly. Like if Elon Musk or Steve Jobs walked into the room, we might run the other way because it's like, what are you doing here? Go back. But had he been alive still, because of what these guys accomplish, society looks to them and it's like, wow. With Eve, I don't think it was like that. Eve complemented what Adam did, but Eve was created from her very conception. She was created in function of Adam. I know this doesn't sound nice, but in the sense that Adam was alone. God had created humanity, so to speak, in the person of Adam. And then he realizes Adam is alone. He needs somebody. So he creates somebody, in a sense, in function of Adam. And that's not a bad thing. So I'm not saying it's like second-class citizens or you only exist in function of men or anything. What it means is, while Adam's mission tends to be oriented towards working with stuff, Eve's mission will be to work with people. Eve is going to be more relational than Adam. And that also means, we could say, there's a greater beauty in Eve than there is in Adam. Because when you are oriented towards relationship, what is it that makes us beautiful, ultimately, as spiritual beings? Not just as like beautiful in the sense that a sunrise is beautiful, but as spiritual beings, what is it that makes us beautiful? It is love. It is the adornment of the virtues. It is relationship. It is that God-likeness. And God is a Trinity. This is also the reason why Adam and Eve were incomplete. When God just made Adam, we were incomplete because to be made in the image of God, God is a Trinity. The Jewish people didn't know it back in the time that Genesis was written. They just thought of this monolithic being. But God is a Trinity. He's a relationship of persons. So for Adam to be complete means there had to be a relationship. For him to completely image God and be in his likeness, there had to be a relationship. And therefore Adam and Eve created relationship between them. And God created us in such a way that all persons of the Trinity are in one way or another represented. You have Adam clearly representing the Father, Eve, interestingly enough, representing the Son, but in the sense that, okay, who is God the Son before he became incarnate as Jesus Christ? Logos. Logos is God's kind of self-reflection of his own perfection to such an extent that it's actually another equal person. So the Logos, just like Eve, only, you could say, exists, only has meaning in function of already a relationship to somebody else. This is not chronological, so I mean, I don't want to delve into Trinitarian theology because every time you forget to dot an I in Trinitarian theology, you are a heretic and you get burned and has consequences. But we could say, not in a chronological sense, but kind of in a metaphysical sense, if God the Father is the origin, and it is from that origin that God the Son issues forth, proceeds is the theological word that we use, then God the Son is only, in a sense, only has meaning and existence in relationship to the Father who is the origin, right? And there is this bond in between them. The love that is between them is the Holy Spirit. So God made us, not a perfect analogy, but he made us analogous to the Trinity in the sense that there is a father figure, Adam, there is a relational figure, Eve, and between them, the love that is between them begets new life, children, which represent in a family the Holy Spirit. And therefore, in that sense, we are made in the image and likeness of God too, and we're only complete when there are relationships of love like that. When I said that Eve was more beautiful than Adam, and again, this bears itself out in today's society, okay? Because frequently, when you look at marriages, for example, and husbands and wives fighting, which is seemingly your recreation in life, is to get in fights over things. It's like, what do? Husband goes to work. I understand today, now we have 20th and 21st century, both parents may go to work, but still, generally speaking, the wife is still going to be home more, earlier, dealing with the kids before the husband gets home, generally speaking. But in a classic family arrangement, the husband goes to work, he does what he does, and he will find fulfillment in the sense that I'm loving my family by making the sacrifices necessary to go out and work and sweat and do these things. And a lot of the times, husbands would prefer not to be doing what they're doing out there. They would prefer to be able to have the luxury to be with the family or kids a little more, but it's their sacrifice that they make in order to benefit the family. And then the wife, who is with the kids, the husband comes home and maybe is not as attentive to the wife and kids as she would like, so then she will be like, saying, you come home, you never say hi, your kids are there and whatnot, and what's happening is their minds are in two different places. So it requires effort on our parts. And again, this is the fruits of fallen human nature, right? But the wife generally is going to be more oriented towards the relational element, and the husband's mind is going to be out in the sacrifices he makes in order to take care of the family. Both of them are expressing love, but they're expressing it in a different way. And we need to learn how to, as couples then, constantly be dialoguing and recognizing and acknowledging and complimenting one another in the different ways that we express and live our love. And because we're weak and we're broken, then we tend to get in fights over those things, because it's like the husband feels there's an injustice. Hey, I've been out there all this time slaving and this is what I get. And the wife is like, you come home and you don't even pay attention to us, and what do you care more about your work? And then, so on and so forth. We've all heard this recording many times before, right? The reason, I'm sorry, I got on a sidetrack. The reason I mentioned that Eve is more beautiful is when you are relational, and this also bears itself out, guys who go around trying to look good before women are weirdos. They're the last guys that you would ever want. Like, guys, I remember, I'm not going to mention, but guys that want to be pretty, quote unquote, it's like, no, don't go there. You may want to be impressive and be macho and athletic and kind of show to a certain extent, but guys that are too concerned with what they look like, it's like cold shivers down the spine. Women, on the other hand, it's different. Obviously, there's a not so Christian version of female vanity and flaunting your bodies and whatnot, but guys tend to be more visually oriented and more drawn towards the beauty of women, and women tend to be more in need of the affirmation that comes from men than vice versa. You look at guys my age, it's like, you can have a gut hanging out, we don't care. It's like, it's whatever, because that's not where we find our affirmation or our power or our security in life a lot of the time. Some of these guys, it's like they're slobs, but they're totally comfortable with themselves because they accomplish things. With women, it's a little different. You're going to find, to a greater extent, your security in not only being physically attractive, but just being appreciated and esteemed and whatnot. And that's because there's an identity that is related to beauty. Okay. Now I keep using the word beauty, and I'm doing what I always do, which is talk way too much. So, I will end with briefly, what the heck is beauty anyway? Okay. Seems self-evident. St. Thomas Aquinas, when you want to know what something is, something self-evident is, you go to St. Thomas Aquinas, and then he'll show you that you didn't actually know. The first part is self-evident. So he says, beauty is that which gives pleasure when seen, right? You see a beautiful sunset, it brings a pleasure. You see a beautiful person, it brings a pleasure. You see a beautiful cheesecake, whatever, brings a pleasure. But he says within that there are three elements. And in Latin, I will read them in Latin and then say what they actually mean. Don't worry, I also had to look up what they actually mean because I only had a rough idea. So the three elements of beauty are consonantia, claritas, and integritas. Consonantia, consonance, just means proportionality. So, I'll give you an example. This was probably 15 years ago. I once saw, when I was living in the Philippines, there was, with computers, they said, what does the ideal of beauty in different nations look like? And all they did, it was women, all they did was take, like, you know, a couple of thousand women from the Philippines, a couple of thousand women from Germany, a couple of thousand women from Nigeria, whatever, and the computer would just blend all the images and come up with what the average of all those images was. Countries like the US and Brazil and some of those where you've got African, Asian, Indian, and European descent all mixed together, we came out a little bit kind of like nobody in the United States actually looks like that. Countries where you're pretty much from one stock, like a lot of the African countries and the Filipinos and whatnot, looked more like somebody you might actually see. But the faces were strikingly beautiful. When you take the average of all of that, they were all these strikingly beautiful faces. And the reason is consonance, proportionality. Every one of us has, as individuals, we got your nose is just a little bit bigger than it should have been, or your left ear is just a little higher, or something weird. But if you take the average of everything, you'll come with, you know, the balanced element, and it's always this proportionality. And if you look at models and whatnot, and especially now with computers and plastic surgery, they take anything that's slightly off and then they tweak it, so now you look like some artificial Greek god or goddess. Claritas. Well, I'm going to go to claritas last because it's the least evident. Integritas means wholeness. So if something is missing, then it won't be beautiful. Imagine you have the statue of Michelangelo's David and you knocked off an arm. It's like, okay, well, it's now it's mutilated, right? And not only physically that it has to be complete, but as human beings too. You know, you could take, for example, Joseph Stalin. Had a lot of human qualities. Unfortunately, he was lacking one major quality, which was love. So therefore, he's not beautiful as a person. He had leadership. He had a certain kind of a charm that he could put on when he wanted to. I mean, none of these dictators could lead countries and masses of people unless they had a certain charm that they could put on when they wanted to. Had a certain vision, you know, all kinds of wonderful things you could say about him, and qualities that he had much more than I have, probably willpower and a lot of these things, probably more intelligent. But I like to think I'm a more beautiful person than Joseph Stalin as a person, although not everyone who goes to confession with me agrees, but because he clearly was a person who was lacking love. Hopefully, you know, there's always room for that last second conversion, but leading up to his death, there were not a lot of signs of salvation there, a lot of signs of God's presence. That's the lack of integrity. And claritas is the radiance of the inner essence. So that was my own wording because the other one was even less clear. But claritas in the sense that something that is beautiful, it demonstrates clearly what it is in its essence. puppies are cute because they can't help it. They just radiate this innocent puppiness, you know, and it just kind of shines through. There's a tenderness and a youth and a, you know, playfulness and all those things that are part of puppy nature. And Adam and Eve were each very beautiful. But I would argue that Eve was the fairest flower of God's creation, which was the title of this talk, meditation. It's going to turn into a talk because I've talked the whole time, so very little time left to pray.